daughter is to have been adopted. But really, we're the lucky ones. Learn more at adoptuskids.org.
At the end of the day, it is clear that the current status quo with the Venezuelan regime is intolerable for the United States.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio defends the Trump administration's pressure campaign against Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. The UN declares famine is over in Gaza, but warns the situation is still critical. 500,000 people urgently need food. And a second day of protests in Bangladesh over the death of a leading figure of last year's student uprising. Russia's president is warning that his troops are advancing rapidly across the battlefield in Ukraine. Speaking at his annual news conference lasting for more than 4 hours, Vladimir Putin declared his forces would make more gains by the end of the year. Yulia Shapovalova reports from Moscow.
The very first question addressed to Putin was about the war in Ukraine. According to the Russian president, Moscow is ready to end the conflict if Ukraine completely withdraws its troops from 4 of its regions: Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson.
Now they refuse to end this conflict by peaceful means, and still we see certain signals, including from the Kyiv regime, that they are ready to conduct some kind of dialogue. The only thing I want to say is we are ready and want to end this conflict by peaceful means.
But while peaceful means are not in use, Russia resorts to its military, declaring that the Russian army has become the most combat-ready in the world.
Immediately after our troops knocked the enemy out of the Kursk region, the initiative entirely passed into the hands of the Russian armed forces. This means that our troops are advancing along the entire front line.
Putin does not consider Russia responsible for the deaths of people, because, according to him, Russia did not start this war. He blamed the West for it. But he once again ruled out any Russia's aggression against Europe.
There will be no military operations if you treat us with respect, respect our interests, just as we constantly tried to respect yours. If you don't cheat on us, as you did with the expansion of NATO to the east.
Commenting on EU's attempts to seize Russian assets to help finance Ukraine, President Putin promised Moscow will defend its interests in court.
Theft is an inappropriate term, as it implies the secret theft of property. But here they're trying to do it openly. This is robbery. But why can't this robbery be carried out? Because the consequences could be severe for the robbers.
The lion's share of the conference was devoted to Russia's very own economic, demographic and social problems, but Putin mostly repeated his own previously made statements.
Organizers say they received more than 3 million questions for this event, but the main question, the one that worries Russians the most, when will the war end, remains unanswered. Putin's position, however, is clear. If Russia's political demands are not met, then it will continue to fight. Yulia Shapovalova, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Putin spoke hours after the European Union announced it would loan more than $105 billion to Ukraine for the next 2 years. But the funds will not be backed by Russian assets that are frozen in European banks. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that his country needs money to produce enough drones, one of its main weapons in its battle against Russia. Audrey McAlpine reports from Kyiv.
Oleg sells trinkets from a table on the side of the street. But on cold winter evenings in Kyiv, customers are few and far between.
Everything changed with the beginning of the war, because my business is designed for tourists and there are no tourists, as you know.
Oleg doesn't qualify for a government pension and says his only plan is to keep on working into his 90s if necessary. Taxes in Ukraine cover just half the country's budget, and it all goes to military defenses. Allied nations, mostly in Europe, subsidize everything else: education, healthcare, and social welfare. And without that support, Ukraine's financial future would be even bleaker.
Part of countries in blackout, power grid is severely destroyed and damaged, economy is ruined. So all of these need money to continue to run the country.
But despite the decision to lend Ukraine $105 billion interest-free, With funds raised from international banks and backed by Europe's own budgets, some politicians here say it's still not enough, with so many here in need. Including soldiers who must be mobilized, says military researcher Gleb Volosky.
It is the fourth year of war, and the people who were idealistic and who were ready to volunteer to go and fight are running out. So the mobilization process are getting harder and harder, and Ukraine really needs additional incentives to speed up the process.
Russian assets seized in Europe could, in future, help finance post-war reconstruction. But in the meantime, European leaders insist Ukraine should not only strengthen its defense industry, but also its rule of law, and combat corruption that's plagued President Zelensky's administration in recent months.
There is a fight against corruption in Ukraine. We need to do everything we can in order to show that every penny comes to stop Russians and to keep tens of millions of people alive and helping them to survive.
For Ukraine, that survival will require strength, not just on the front line, but in diplomacy too. Audrey McAlpine, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
Israeli forces have hit a school being used as a shelter in Gaza City, killing at least 6 Palestinians. Sources say tank shells hit the second floor of the educational facility near a hospital where displaced families had gathered for a wedding. Children are among the injured. And the UN-backed body that monitors food security, the IPC, says there's still a severe shortage in Gaza despite improvements during the ceasefire. 500,000 people urgently need food, with the levels of acute malnutrition high in Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis and Gaza City. And in the next year, nearly 101,000 Palestinian children under the age of 5 are expected to be malnourished, and 37,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women will require treatment to avoid starving to death. Tarek Abu Azoum is in Gaza City, where displaced Palestinian families are still struggling to get food and supplies.
So while UN agencies say Gaza is no longer in famine conditions, that does not mean the crisis is over. This, behind me, is one of the UNRWA aid distribution centres that is right now completely shut down and turned into a mass displacement camp for Gaza's residents. People here are living in unbearable conditions, and the UN is still warning that the reduced food rations, the ongoing access restrictions, and also their inability to bring a scaled-up delivery for aid supplies is making the crisis even more worse and could quickly reverse all recent gains. So what we can see on the ground is a continuation for the humanitarian miseries. Families are living inside these makeshift tents, depending on a very smaller food rations that cannot be even enough for them. They say that what comes into the strip could seem as commercial goods rather than aid supplies, but the vast majority of UN agencies are still battling to scale up humanitarian deliveries and believe that without a sustained and a comprehensive deliveries for aid supplies, the situation in Gaza will completely worsen within the coming weeks, specifically for families who are living in makeshift tents and suffering to bear up and to cope with the ongoing deterioration of weather conditions and the unfolding humanitarian misery across the Strip. Tarek Abu Azoum, Al Jazeera, Gaza City, Palestine.
The US Secretary of State has talked about the next stages of the Gaza peace process during an extensive end-of-year news conference. Marco Rubio says new governance structure will soon be in place, followed by the deployment of foreign troops. Shahab Ratanzi has more from Washington, D.C.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says a Gaza ceasefire had been unthinkable before Donald Trump became president. And he added that now a process is underway to rebuild the territory that may take generations. But the starting point is the formation of what the U.S. calls a Board of Peace, an international body to oversee the process, and the naming of a technocratic Palestinian leadership for day-to-day governance. When pushed about the total disarmament of Hamas, Rubio took a pragmatic approach.
What that entails, we're going to leave that to the technical teams to work on. It would have to be something, obviously, that they're willing to agree to, that our partners can push them and pressure them to agree to. It also has to be something that Israel agrees to.
But Rubio insisted that the foundations for lasting peace were in place despite day-to-day Israeli violations of the ceasefire.
How long can this continue? How long can the Israelis be allowed to show such disrespect to President Trump?
Well, that's your characterization of it about the term disrespect. What I would say is this. This was, first of all, it was a miracle that it happened in the first place. We all understand how difficult it was for that to come to the conclusion that it did, where the bombing and everything else, the scale and scope of what we saw ended, all the hostages were released, and we have relative peace right now for the most part, despite the things you're pointing to.
On the economic blockade of Venezuela, Rubio played down remarks by White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles that the goal was to make Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president, cry uncle, that is, regime change.
I mean, you can interpret any way you want, but at the end of the day, it is clear that the current status quo with the Venezuelan regime is intolerable for the United States. Our goal is to change that dynamic. And that's why the president's doing what he's doing. Change that dynamic by ensuring that no one wants to get on drug boats anymore.
Throughout the press conference, Marco Rubio underlined that the Trump administration's foreign policy would be based on the U.S.'s national interest, wherever that may be, but with a priority on the Western Hemisphere. Shia Britansi, Al Jazeera, the State Department.
Republican political strategist Amy Koch says Rubio's news conference showed Washington as a new approach to foreign policy.
I feel like on Venezuela, there were some questions that I still had that I was wondering about his answers. I thought his talk about the coalition and those countries that are being of real help, like Mexico, El Salvador, he mentioned multiple Central and South American countries that are helping us. You know, he was very smart, as he said. He avoided conversation about regime change and also kind of the question of could they do a land strike and then, you know, give congressional notification. I think all of that was a lot of new information and coming from such a high level, it was important information. He reiterated so many times that we do these things in the interest of our own national security. So when he was asked a question about Venezuela, or when he was asked a question about Gaza or Ukraine, he always inserted the sort of national interest piece that was guiding these decisions. And so in that way, and then also, as he said, you know, the idea of sort of being a disruptor on the international stage when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to, you know, how we interact, you know, how we work with our allies, how we approach these conflicts. You know, I think there was sort of that also, like there, not just that there's a new sheriff in town, but that we are approaching these, the ways we've been doing this have not been effective, have not been bringing about peace, and we are taking a very different tact.
Protesters have rallied across Bangladesh for a second day in a row. They're calling for the arrest of a gunman who shot and killed one of the leaders of last year's pro-democracy uprising. The interim government is calling for calm. Tanveer Chowdhury reports from Dhaka.
Bangladesh is on edge after the death of Sharif Usman Hadi, a leading figure in the student uprising that helped topple Sheikh Hasina's government last year. On December the 12th, Hadi was injured in a drive-by shooting in the capital. After nearly a week in hospital, he died on Thursday. The news triggered anger across the country.
Those involved in the killing of Hadi must be brought to justice, even if they have fled abroad. We are also seeing provocations by former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina while staying in India, and she should be extradited.
Until India's aggression stops and slain student leader Sharif Hadi is given justice, we will not leave.
2 media outlets were attacked with arson and vandalism reported. Security forces cordoned off the area while investigators assess the damage.
As an ordinary citizen, I feel unsafe. The security situation is not strong enough, and the government needs to be much more effective in ensuring law and order.
The interim government issued a statement condemning mob violence and calling the attacks an assault on democracy and press freedom. Chief Advisor Muhammad Yunus pledged justice and promised to stand by journalists. On Friday, students came out in their numbers again. Major protests in the capital city Dhaka and across the country. Students are demanding justice for the killing of prominent student leader Usman Hadi. Security is heightened and government is asking the protesters to remain calm and not take the path of violence. As Bangladesh moves towards election and a national referendum next year, the government has warned that the choices made in the coming days could shape the country's future. Samit Chaudhry, Al Jazeera, Dhaka.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, fears grow that Sudan may end up in a permanent state of fragmentation as conflict grinds on across the country. Plus,
I'm Charlie Andrew in Copenhagen, where after 400 years, the age of letters is ending as the country shifts deeper into the digital era.
We heard you. You come to Free Speech TV seeking opportunities to join others on the front lines of resistance. Our FSTV Speaks series connects you with advocacy campaigns, events, and resources from other high-impact movement partners. We hope you'll find a lasting organizing home with one or more of them. Together, through collective action, we'll grow the resistance movement to win the future we deserve.
10 years from now, whose voices will shape America? The liars and grifters? Or the progressive voices holding the powerful to account? You can make sure independent media survives, not just today, but for years to come. Consider adding Free Speech TV to your will or estate plan. To learn more, call us at 303-542-4819. Thank you.
You're tuned into Free Speech TV, where we recognize that race and class shape our world. Join us as we delve into stories of resilience, resistance, and solidarity across diverse communities.
At Free Speech TV, we're more than a network. We're a movement, a trusted source for independent, unapologetic, and people-powered media. And now your organization can stand with us. FSTV invites mission-aligned companies and nonprofits to amplify their impact through our underwriting program. A powerful way to connect with millions who care about social justice, democracy, and a better world. Our viewers are change makers, twice as likely to engage in advocacy, activism, and giving. Underwriting with FSTV allows your brand to align with these values, reinforcing your commitment to a just and sustainable world. Plus, as a 501c3 nonprofit, your contribution is tax deductible, a win-win for your organization and our fight for a just future. If you're interested in joining our underwriting program, please email underwriting@freespeech.org. Thank you.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. Russia's president is warning his troops are advancing rapidly across the battlefield in Ukraine. In an annual address, Vladimir Putin says he's confident they will achieve their military goals if Kyiv doesn't agree to its peace conditions. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has defended the Trump administration's pressure campaign on Venezuela. Rubio accused Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's leadership of being illegitimate. And a UN-backed body that monitors food security says access to food in Gaza has improved during the ceasefire, but the IPC warns the situation remains critical, with the entire strip still facing starvation. Lebanese and Israeli civilian representatives have held another round of talks in a coastal border town. They're part of a ceasefire monitoring mechanism led by the US, and they are the first direct negotiations in decades. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have been striking Lebanon nearly every day. Zaina Khudr reports from Nakura in southern Lebanon.
Madrid, 1991. Lebanon and Israel hold bilateral negotiations as part of a Middle East peace conference. There were no results. The last deal was in 1983 after Israel's invasion of Lebanon. The U.S. brokered agreement was supposed to end the state of war, but a lack of national consensus led to internal fighting and the treaty collapsed. 4 decades later, Israeli and Lebanese diplomats are engaging in their first direct talks under the auspices of a U.S.-led military committee monitoring the November 2024 ceasefire. They are being held behind closed doors here in the coastal town of Nakura, close to the border with Israel. And many in Lebanon are asking, will this time be different? Discussions are supposed to focus on solidifying what has largely been a one-sided ceasefire. At least that is what Lebanon wants. The Israeli army still occupies more than 10 square kilometers of Lebanese territory along the border and continues to carry out attacks under the pretext of preventing Hezbollah from rebuilding its military capabilities.
The current talks are focused on that, but over time it's possible that they could evolve into broader topics that could begin to consider issues of a full cessation of hostilities. I doubt it will get to anything relating to peace, but certainly not now.
Lebanon's leaders say they have no choice but to engage in negotiations to avoid a new conflict. But they also say it doesn't amount to broader peace discussions, which the Trump administration has been pushing for. Even though the participants say security and economic tracks are advancing in parallel. Hezbollah has criticized the state's decision.
You offered a free concession, and this concession will neither change the enemy's position nor its aggression and its occupation.
The balance of power is not in the armed group's favor, but its rhetoric remains defiant. Hezbollah says it will only discuss disarmament when Israel stops bombing. Israel, for its part, says its troops will only withdraw when Hezbollah no longer poses a threat. Conditions set in public that question whether a security understanding, a political breakthrough, or what at all can be achieved behind closed doors. Sana Khuder, Al Jazeera, Nakura, southern Lebanon.
The Sudanese army has reasserted control in the capital Khartoum, but fighters from the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces are advancing in the west, capturing cities and strategic locations. Mohammed Val reports from Port Sudan.
That's the Rapid Support Forces second-in-command Abdurrahim Dagalo on Wednesday, marking the takeover of Sudan's most strategic oil field in South Kordofan state. It's his group's latest territorial gain, and a scene no one could have predicted a few months ago. But Sudan's conflict has seen surprising shifts in just a year. This was how the map of control looked in early January. The RSF controlled most of Darfur, parts of Kordofan, the capital Khartoum, the second most important state of Wad Madani, as well as parts of Sennar in the southeast. But in the same month, they were expelled from most of those areas, including Khartoum, a highly symbolic loss. For a while, the momentum seemed to be on the side of the Sudanese army. The picture seemed rosy, and preparations were underway here in Port Sudan to move the seat of government back to Khartoum. But despite setbacks, the RSF remained strong. It still controlled most of Darfur, and it was laying siege to 4 state capitals or key cities across western Sudan: El Fasher, Baba Nusa, Kadugli, and Delenj. In October, and after a year and a half of siege, the RSF took El Fasher, Darfur's last major city, and began a major push into neighboring Kordofan. A few weeks later, they stormed Baba Nusa in western Kordofan. Then Hejlij fell without much resistance. And fears grew that they might do the same in Kadugli and Delenj before marching to El Ubayd and then on to Khartoum. The Sudanese army allied factions include groups that hail from Darfur. Losing their lands to the RSF was a major shock to morale. Their commanders, after years in the comfort of high-ranking political positions in Port Sudan, had to don uniforms, return to the field, and revive the fighting spirit among their troops. But after 2 years and a half of bloodshed, the prospects are grimmer than ever. The gains on every side tend to be fleeting. All peace initiatives have so far stumbled. The war has turned into a Sisyphean exercise with no end in sight, and it's mostly civilians who are paying the biggest price. The fear here is a permanent fragmentation of Sudan, with the western regions under the RSF becoming a real or a de facto breakaway state. Many believe only a miracle can prevent such a probability. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera, Port Sudan.
The United Nations says the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo has forced at least 84,000 people into neighbouring Burundi. Boats of refugees are arriving daily from the border city of Uvira. The UN Refugee Agency says the numbers are overwhelming Burundi. Rwandan-backed M23 rebels captured Uvira earlier last week, but say they'll withdraw in the coming days. Burundi has appealed for $35 million to cope with the influx. And one of France's most famous landmarks is fully reopened to visitors after a strike by workers was called off. The Louvre Museum was partially closed in the past few days because unions say staff are overworked. They're calling for pay rises and the hiring of more workers. Management has been criticised after a jewel heist in October, raising questions about the Louvre's security. Denmark's about to deliver its last post. After 400 years, its National Postal Service will shut down and letter collection and delivery will end at the end of the month. Charlie Angela reports from Copenhagen on a first for any country in Europe.
For Jette Hjarta, sending Christmas cards is more than a tradition. It's a small act of resistance. The number of letters sent in Denmark has collapsed by more than 90% in the last 25 years.
I think it's such a pity. But of course, I understand personally because we live in a digital world and that's how it goes with everything. So it's not so personal anymore as it used to be because it's digital. Normally there were about 25, 30 cards every year, but last year there was only 2 cards.
All of the red post boxes in her region have been removed. She now has a long walk to a local supermarket to deposit her mail. Sending a standard letter costs nearly $8, and for many Danes, that sealed their fate. For PostNord 2, letters have simply become too expensive to handle. It's redirecting resources to the booming parcel industry. Historians are not surprised Denmark is the first country in Europe to do away with its national postal system and expects other countries will follow.
Denmark is one of the most digitalized countries in the world. We are very familiar with getting all kinds of communication from the state or from the businesses or even the banks through our digital mailboxes. So if we look at the history, we can see that 25 years ago, we were like sending 1.4 billion letters each year. And now it's more like 100 million.
Danes will still be able to send letters through a small private rival, Dow, but only by visiting a branch. Across the world, the story is largely the same. Email, smartphones and online platforms have largely replaced paper. National postal services are suffering.
These 2 post boxes will be the last to be removed in Denmark, turned into museum exhibits marking the end of an era. What will be lost when letters disappear will be hard to measure, but countries will be watching closely as Denmark makes a shift that cannot be undone.
For Jette and her family, it could mean the end of a long tradition.
Yeah, I'm going to treasure this one. Maybe it's going to be the last one I get.
The age of handwritten connection quietly fading. Charlie Angela, Al Jazeera, Copenhagen.
And that's it from me, Imran Khan. You can find more information on our website, aljazeera.com. But the news continues here on Al Jazeera after counting the cost.
Is it time to say goodbye to your old car? Give it a second life and give our planet a fighting chance. When you donate your vehicle, you keep waste out of landfills, help protect our climate, and power the independent media that drives real change. Turn your old ride into a force for good. Every mile it drove can still move us forward. Visit vehiclesforcharity.org and choose Free Speech TV as your charity today. Movements don't start with crowds. They start with one voice, one act of courage, one person willing to stand up. And when they do, others follow. That's what a frontline founder is to FSTV. A leader, a change maker, the spark that lights the blaze. With the gift of $1,000 or more towards FSTV's matching fund, you can help ignite a movement. You inspire thousands of others to support independent progressive media that speaks truth to power. So if you believe in what we do here, if FSTV matters to you, now's the time to make a difference. Together, we are louder, bolder, and impossible to ignore. Your voice, your action, your commitment makes this community strong. Become a frontline funder today. Be the voice that leads the way. To learn more, call 303-542-4819.
Hi, I'm Alexis Grace with Mississippi Votes, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
Hello, I'm Neve Parker. This is Counter the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, nations are drowning in debt and the world could soon owe more than it earns. But when does borrowing become too much? And how would that affect us all? Debt crises have mostly hit poorer nations the hardest, but today some of the richest countries are borrowing at alarming levels. Is their debt now at risk of spiraling out of control? Debt is rising, and so is the cost of servicing it. Markets are already on edge. Could this trigger the next financial crisis, or will governments get their house in order? Governments around the world now owe nearly $100 trillion in public debt. That's almost double what they owed just a decade ago. The International Monetary Fund warns that by 2029, global debt will surpass 100% of the world's GDP, meaning the world's borrowing could soon exceed the size of the entire global economy. That threshold could be crossed much sooner if economic growth slows or interest payments are higher than expected. But there's a stark contrast. Richer nations can, for now, still borrow at lower costs and keep spending, while many poorer nations are running out of room to take on more debt. But when borrowing becomes too big, who pays the price? We will discuss this with our guest shortly, but first let's take a look at why governments borrow in the first place. Governments borrow to fill the gap between public spending and the money raised from tax revenue and other income. They borrow from global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, from other countries and from commercial banks. They also raise money by selling bonds, often to institutional investors or pension funds. Borrowing is usually sustainable when interest rates aren't too high or when the loan is used to generate more income and create long-term economic growth. However, it can be a problem when loans grow faster than a country's economy and when a government can only afford to cover the interest on its debt with no economic return. And that's becoming a global issue, including in some of the group of 7 richest countries. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom have the biggest problems. All 3 have a deficit between what they spend and what they bring in through taxes. Global institutions are now warning the world's debt is reaching dangerous levels and could soon spiral out of control. Governments may find themselves obliged to raise taxes or cut spending to repay loans, but this doesn't go well with voters. Until recently, debt distress was largely a crisis in developing nations, with at least 55 countries struggling to meet their obligations. But now some of the wealthiest nations could also be at risk. Imogen Kimber reports.
World debt is skyrocketing. The International Monetary Fund says the sum of all government debt is on course to hit more than 100% of the world's gross domestic product, or worse.
In an extreme but plausible scenario, with a 5% probability, that would reach 123% of GDP in 2029. So truly very high level.
This would be the highest level since 1948, after World War II. The IMF says governments need to act now.
It's very important to prioritize fiscal policy right now to ensure debt sustainability and prepare fiscal buffers, ensure fiscal space to use in case of severe adverse shocks, including the eventuality of a financial crisis.
Government debt was thought of as a burden for lower-income countries. Now, some of the richest countries in the world have a debt problem. The US has the biggest economy in the world and the biggest debt, at $38 trillion. That's 125% of its GDP. Major economies including France, the UK and China also have huge debt. Borrowing ramped up during the COVID-19 pandemic, when interest rates were lower, but they've since risen, and so has the cost of the debt. The IMF says governments need to change what they're spending the money they've borrowed on.
Do the structural reform and the productivity enhancing measures, because they will not only increase your income, there will also be a considerable contribution to the fiscal adjustment effort.
Many countries are bolstering defence budgets, despite this not bringing revenue. Economists say increasing public spending for education and infrastructure could boost economic growth, although historically IMF loans have come with conditions of cuts in public spending. And some economists say boosting economic growth may not be a realistic plan.
The best thing that one could do would be to increase GDP, to increase economic growth. The problem with this is that it's very hard to increase GDP growth. So the other alternative is to reduce the deficit. And to reduce the deficit, you either need to collect more taxes or you need to cut public expenditure.
But this is usually unpopular with the electorate. However, it's still lower-income countries that suffer the most under the burden of debt. Debt ratios to GDP are lower in poorer countries, but interest rates are higher, and creating a fiscal buffer is harder.
Why should African countries borrow so expensive as compared to its peers in other parts of the world? Why should it be? Why should the risk premium for African countries be so different from Europe, America, and other parts of the world?
Activists say what's known as the Common Framework, that's the plan the IMF sets out for repayments by lower-income countries, needs to be restructured. But what economists, activists and lenders agree on is that the current system of global borrowing and spending is pushing the world towards a financial crisis. And the longer it takes to reform, the higher the cost for everyone. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, let's discuss this further with our panel of guests. Joining us from London is Anne Pettifor. She's the Director of Prime Economics, which focuses on policy research into macroeconomics. In Singapore, we're joined by Alex Holmes. He's the Regional Director for the Asia Pacific, the Economic Intelligence Unit, a business research and analysis group. And in Accra, we're joined by Daniel Amate Anim. He's the Chief Economist at the Policy Initiative for Economic Development in Africa, an economic and policy think tank. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Welcome to Counting the Cost. So, Anne, global public debt is expected to rise way above 100% of the world's economic output by 2029. These are clearly more than dry numbers. Why should ordinary people around the world care?
Well, first of all, I want to begin by saying that debt is not in itself a bad thing, and that we need it to finance activity, and that, the question is whether or not we're investing in economies in order to generate the income needed to repay the debt. And the debt, though high in advanced economies, is actually rather sustainable in those economies, even when they arrive at about 100% of GDP. But in low-income countries, where the debt is often in foreign currency, those high levels of debt are excruciatingly painful for those economies. They are actually resulting in, I think, widespread degradation of health and of social welfare. So it's a crisis for low-income countries far more than it is for high-income countries. And for high-income countries, it's a function of economic weakness, of economic failure. And that failure derives, in the first instance, from the great financial crisis, 2007-9, from which many rich countries have not fully recovered, including my own. And then, of course, that was compounded by the COVID pandemic. So these are big crises that have hit the global economy. And instead of responding by investing and encouraging more economic activity, countries went into austerity mode And that made things a lot worse in economic terms.
Daniel, turning to you, debt is a double-edged sword, says Anne. Your thoughts?
You know, when it comes to debt, especially with developing economics like my own Ghana, you know, it's a very huge issue because we spend almost about 65 to 70% of our revenue in servicing debt. And what it means is that we have sacrificed other sectors of the economy to the extent that repayment obligation is even more than budgetary allocation for health and education. So the big question is that how do you then develop your economies? Now, because most of the debt contracted are in dollars or foreign currency, so to speak, there is what could be described as a currency risk. And anytime the economy is unable to generate sufficient revenue to be able to meet repayment obligation, then we have an issue. Let me use Ghana as an empirical example, where it got into a point we were unable to meet our repayment obligation. And the only way out is to resort to the IMF bailout in order to get some, credibility in the eyes of the investor community. We've gotten to a point where the economy couldn't generate sufficient inflow, principally because most of these facilities that were contracted, were used for the purposes of consumption, were not invested into the rich sectors of the economy to be able to generate sufficient inflow to meet repayment obligation. As much as I agree that debt in itself is not bad for Africa, it is the management of same, So that's the difficulty we have in ability of the African economies to manage debt. So debt sustainability is very key. As long as they could go to the capital market to borrow, they keep on rushing, borrowing without necessarily doing the analysis to ensure whether they'll be able to meet repayment obligation.
Turning to you, Alex, Daniel's made it clear that any loans need to be very, very wisely invested for this balance to work well. I mean, what does global debt outstripping economic output globally mean in your part of the world?
Yes, so debt is one of those subjects that's filled with big, scary numbers. But I think as Anne has alluded to, it requires a lot of nuance in talking about what actually it means for sustainable debt. It depends what you invested into and whether that delivers a return. It depends on whom you owe the debt to, and it also depends on your cost of servicing the debt and what those interest rates are. Two of the big countries that are often raised in my region with concerns to debt are Japan and China. And if you're looking for kind of the next big debt crisis to emanate from these two countries in 2026, it's probably not going to happen. And there's a number of reasons for that. But that doesn't mean that it's not a problem in these two countries. And one of the big underlying issues with these two countries is also actually the revenue that's needed to service these debts and the underlying demographics in these two countries that means that debt is going to become an increasing problem.
And turning to you, because many rich countries borrow heavily without any real immediate fear of default. Why can countries like the United States, the UK, and France and Japan live with such high debt while other nations can't?
So, Japan's a very interesting case in the sense that actually most of the debt owed is owed to domestic lenders. And so, therefore, that's why Japan has debt which is more than 200% of GDP, and it's not a problem. The real problem is why countries have been persuaded, countries in Africa in particular, to borrow from private lenders in the international capital markets. That's the big problem. The IMF has encouraged countries not to develop their own monetary systems and their own economic systems, to be, if you like, autonomous in their financing of economic activity. But instead, they've been persuaded to borrow from private bond markets at very high real rates of interest which I think are a form of usury. They are highly exploitative and extractive. And the IMF is happy with that. In fact, I know that the IMF more or less endorsed and sometimes guaranteed borrowing by low-income countries, including countries like Ghana, from private lenders, from the private bond markets at very high real rates of interest.
I wonder if you could underscore why do you think the IMF is happy with that?
because, you know, the way the international financial system works is that it's effectively been privatized. And private lenders want to be able to lend to governments. It's the safest form of lending, because even if that government were to default and not pay her debts, the IMF and the World Bank are there to back up those creditors. So the IMF acts as a sort of gatekeeper for private creditors, for Wall Street, if you like. And as opposed to the years between 1945 and 1971, when countries raised their money domestically at a domestic level and were discouraged from, and where we did not have the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, just as that. You know, the system has been changed and oriented towards the interests, if you like, of Wall Street. And African countries have fallen for that. They should not be doing that.
Right, well, let me put that to Anne. Let me put that to Daniel. So the message from Anne is debt is not a bad thing, but the wrong kind of loans that are exploitative are. How does that affect people across the continent of Africa, Daniel? Because for many developing countries, the debt crisis isn't a future risk, it is here now. What does the debt crisis look like for ordinary families in Africa? And indeed Asia and Latin America for that as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I largely agree with Anne in that, but in her summation. You know, because we borrow at a very high, interest rate, and our economies are not in a position to be able to generate sufficient inflow to meet repayment obligation. And another key area to my mind, which is also worth considering, is that we borrow largely for consumption. And if you borrow for consumption, you are unable to pay because you are supposed to generate internal revenue for consumption. If you borrow, you need to invest it into the real sectors of the economy that have a ripple effect to anchor your economy. Another key area that is affecting the economies of Africa is mismanagement and corruption. Okay, mostly we borrow these monies at the point where we are heading towards election, and such monies are pumped into elections just to win political power. So as much as the high interest rate stipulated by Anne is a key factor, another factor which is internally generated has to do with mismanagement and corruption by African leadership in terms of the management of the monies that are borrowed. They are not really invested into sectors that will support the economy. It is not used to support the private sector, to increase productivity, to create jobs and opportunity, to be able to generate sufficient inflow to support the overall economy. So what it does is that because government is now using that money to meet repayment obligation, government is unable to support education as expected, is unable to support health as expected, government is unable to cater for basic infrastructure facility, and the citizens are further asked to pay more taxes. So the cost of living is very high in almost every African economy, and job creation is at the lowest level, and it's affecting the youth. And that's the reason which most youth in Africa, as much as they have the desire to establish their own enterprises, you see them now resorting to Europe and other Western countries. So these are the effects of high debt on the economies of Africa.
Alex, just turning to East Asia, I mean, China, one of the world's biggest economies. Is there something special about China, the way it's economically insulated, the way it's economically structured, that makes it impervious to these exploitative loan systems and the way it handles debt?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was impervious to exploitative loan systems. And it does, of course, not really borrow much from the rest of the world. So, in fact, it's become a big net lender. So ever since 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative was kicked off and it reached its peak prior to the pandemic and wound down, but has been picking up again since. China has been a big lender to the rest of the world, particularly the emerging world. Now, much of the emerging world was very happy with this. Chinese loans didn't come with the strict conditionality. It didn't come with the lecture. But the problems which David talked about in terms of governance were still there. And many countries took on loans and many governments took on loans, and they became conduits for graft. And they were fed into big projects that became white elephants and didn't produce a return in order to service that debt. Now, that's not true universally, but it is true in many cases. And so Chinese lending has kind of been a hot button topic, and some of it is really helping emerging economies to develop and is coming along with skills and infrastructure and know-how. And some of it is repeating the old mistakes that Anne talks about that have traditionally come from a free market system as well. So again, a nuanced picture, but I think the important things we've gone over before is what is that money used for, and will it produce a return, and that will govern whether debt is sustainable.
Alex, you mentioned China's Belt and Road Initiative. There are many countries, particularly in Central Asia, that borrowed heavily from China, that find themselves heavily indebted to Beijing. Are these entirely above board in your eyes? Because in many ways, being indebted to a nation also means that you are politically forced to be aligned with that nation as well.
I would stop short of calling it a big conspiracy and debt trap diplomacy. I think this is loans that have gone bad and suffered from poor governance in the lenders and poor controls, from the lenders and poor governance by the borrowers.
Let's bring in Anne.
But it has allowed China, for example, Alex, to say, right, if you can't repay your debt, then please we'll have your port in exchange or as compensation for that. And that has enabled China to acquire very important, geopolitically important strategic assets, which she's demanded as compensation for lack of payment.
Well, let's put this also to Daniel as well. China has a huge foothold in multiple African countries. It's invested heavily. It has lent vast sums of money to emerging economies across the continent of Africa. What does that mean for nations' abilities to stand on their own 2 feet, to shape their own geopolitical policies and their own national interests, and put those first above those of a very large country with a very, very large sums of money?
Yeah, thank you very much. If you understand the Chinese in terms of their global approach, their philosophy towards Africa is to support Africa, but predominantly their focus is on our natural resources. Okay, so they have the money. Africa needs the resources. Just like Alex said, in terms of flexibility, getting their loans as compared to that of the capital market is quite okay. But approach is that let's give them the money, let's collateralize the money, use their natural resources as a collateral. So China is interested in sovereign guarantee. They don't deal with private sector, they deal with government, use the state resources as a collateral for that loan. So when you are unable to pay, they have access to your resources. And this is exactly what the Chinese are doing. As much as I appreciate their presence on the continent, they have a philosophy to dominate Africa, so to speak, and also have access to the Africans' large natural resources to drive their industrialization agenda. And this is exactly what's happening. Unfortunately, the economists on the continent of Africa do not understand the global system and how China is operating in terms of their philosophy towards Africa. And if you don't understand what your competitor is doing, you are likely to be exploited indirectly. So this is exactly what is happening on the continent in terms with our relationship with China.
Okay, Alex, turning to you, is there a greater responsibility, or at least should there be a greater responsibility from rich nations who've benefited from cheap borrowing for decades to do more to ease the debt burden of poorer countries?
Well, there should, but unfortunately we're moving to a world that is becoming a bit more multipolar, a bit more fragmented and less of a rules-based order. So the kind of behaviors where countries are lending with not just in mind getting investment return, but with strategic goals as well, is only going to continue. So it's really incumbent on the countries themselves to look inward and their moral compass and see whether find that balance there. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be a big power competition in the world over the coming years. And that kind of topic is going to be lower down the priority list.
There are an awful lot of global factors beyond everyone's control: disease, climate change, demographic change. In the last few moments that we have in this conversation, Anne, I want to ask you about the fact that in Europe, the population is aging fast. rising pensions, healthcare bills are soaring. I mean, can European countries grow enough to pay for all of this? I mean, also countries are being asked, particularly in Europe, to spend more on things like defence, on climate, on infrastructure. All of that is hugely expensive, isn't it?
It absolutely is, but it's entirely affordable because our monetary systems have been designed to enable it. They've evolved over centuries to enable us to do what we can do. We're limited only by what we can do, not by the availability of money. And that's our problem, really, is that we have a misunderstanding of the nature of money, and we've also privatized so much of money that actually, and I just wanted to come back to Daniel's point about, you know, the levels of corruption in Africa. The fact of the matter is that the whole system is corrupt, essentially, and it's breaking down under that corruption. And therefore, I think what is really important now is for African governments to understand that the UN has set up something called a club of borrowers. And just as the lenders are, if you like, organized in a cartel, which is more or less managed by the IMF, so the borrowers should now form a club and jointly and actively come together to put pressure on the rich countries, because as has been said by Alex, the fact is that the rich countries are falling apart there, and their rules-based order is falling apart, and there's fraction and there's friction within the global economy.
Okay,
so that's going to be difficult to handle.
Is it possible to say, yes or no, are we heading for global financial crisis, given that everything that we've discussed in this show so far?
Yes, we are. And the fact of the matter is that the system is profoundly unbalanced. It is, you know, it's profoundly unstable. And the miracle is that we haven't had a financial crisis already. You know, global debt and private debt is a much bigger problem than public debt.
Right.
But global debt is something like 253% of GDP.
Right.
When
thank you for all of that, because as we reach the end of the show, Daniel, I'd like to give the last words to you, because climate disasters, all sorts of political instability across the continent of Africa is pushing vulnerable countries deeper into debt. We know that. Should debt repayments be paused? Should they be cancelled? Is there a way of just saying enough is enough? Daniel.
Yes, you are right. Climate change is affecting the continent in terms of food supply, sustainability, and then other issues, political instability affecting the continent. So my view is that, yes, we need a flexible system in terms of repayment. We need a better deal by these multilateral institutions and these private institutions that we borrow from. That there should be a transparent approach, a more flexible approach in terms of how they deal with African economies, so that we will not overly be hit by the global financial crisis and then the effect of climate change on the continent.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to all three of you. Obviously, it's a huge topic to continue unpicking. Anne Pettifor, Daniel Amate Anim, and Alex Holmes, many thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Neve Barker. And use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Neve Barker from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news is next on Al Jazeera.
My name is Mark Sutton, author of How Democrats Can Win Back Men, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
You've seen how the billionaire class operates. They pour unlimited money into politicians, think tanks, and media outlets to serve their interests, convincing working people to vote against their own future. They fund propaganda, lies, and misinformation to keep us divided and powerless. But here's the thing. We have the numbers. What we don't have yet is the financial power to fight back at their scale. Now imagine if millions of us committed to just $10 a month. That's it, $10. Cost of a couple of coffees, a fast food meal, or a streaming subscription. If we all pitched in, we wouldn't just counter their influence, we'd overwhelm it. The billionaire class funds their machine to keep us powerless. Let's fight like they do. Let's build our movement strong, independent, and unbought. Start your monthly donation today by visiting freespeech.org. We already...
Yeah, it's so sad. It's not...
We had come up with this live storytelling event called Phenomenal. We were really struggling with trying to figure out how to do this ourselves. We contacted Portland Media Center, and they came, scoped out our location.